in our conscious brain, our prefrontal cortex, when we want to hold an idea in our mind, it's basically synapses firing together. The little connections are being made. And you can have about 3 to 5 of these connections at any one time before they start overwriting each other. And then you lose the thread. A story gives you enough of these connections, of these parts firing up in your mind to feel substantial and give direction, but then not too much that it gets lost.
You've spent years mastering your subject, and you deserve to be the most credible voice in the room. But the more you know, the more noise you might be making with your audiences who aren't understanding your expertise. Well, you're suffering from curse of the expert, right? And as you heard, today's guest believes that the structure of story provides your audience with exactly the right combination of synapse connections so they get you, what you're about, and what you're asking them to do. Hello and welcome to the Business of Story. I'm Park Howell. Today, Rob D. Willis joins us. He's a former British music producer turned strategic story producer in Berlin. He's helped tech founders and corporate leaders simplify complexity into stories that move people to act. You'll discover why deep expertise actually creates noise and how story clarifies it. The 4 audience types that should reshape every high-stakes conversation, and the communication grid that turns your story into an actionable strategy. You'll discover why deep expertise actually creates
Hello,
noise.
Rob. Welcome to the show.
Story
Hi,
clarifies
Park. Thank you for having me.
The 4 audience
You're coming
types
to us
that should
from Berlin,
reshape
as I
every
understand,
high-stakes
Yes,
conversation.
Schöneberg and Berlin.
The communication grid that turns
did you grow
your
up out
story
there?
into an
I didn't actually. I'm actually British,
strategy.
but I've lived here
You'll discover
for,
why deep expertise actually
it's getting on
creates
for most
noise
of my life.
and how
About
story
17
clarifies
years.
it.
So not quite half
The
my
4
life.
audience
but,
types that should
I came here
reshape
to study at
every
university.
high-stakes
I did an
conversation,
exchange program
and
here
the
and just
communication
got
grid
stuck,
that turns
basically, and
your
now it's
story
kind of
into
inconvenient
an
to go back.
actionable strategy.
I get you.
You'll
got
discover
stuck. Well,
why
there are
deep
worse places to get
expertise
stuck.
actually
I was in
creates
Berlin
noise
about a year and a half
and
ago
how
for
story
the very first time. I
clarifies
just
it.
loved it.
The
Beautiful
4
place.
audience types
Yeah,
that should
it's
reshape every
great in the summer.
high-stakes
Don't come in the
conversation,
winter.
and the communication
No,
grid
I was
that
there in
turns
October,
your
and it was
story
absolutely beautiful.
into
The
an
colors were
actionable
changing. It was still
strategy.
warm out, cool at
You'll
night.
discover why deep
hit
expertise
Oktoberfest,
actually
the whole
creates
thing. It was
noise
awesome.
and how
Good stuff.
story clarifies it.
Now you
The
come
4
out of
audience
the
types
music
that should
industry
reshape
and
every
are
high-stakes
working
conversation,
specifically
and the
storytelling for
communication
tech.
grid that turns
Tech
your story
leaders,
into
founders,
an
and so forth.
actionable
So,
strategy.
Tell us,
You'll
give us a little
discover
bit of your
why deep
backstory.
expertise actually
What
creates
got you in the
noise
music industry?
and how
What
story
did you do there?
clarifies
I
it.
mean, you were a
The
producer
4
of a lot
audience
of top
types that
10
should reshape
hits
every
there in
high-stakes
Germany, and
conversation,
then how
and
did
the
that make
communication grid that
you
turns
your
your
way
story
into the tech
into
world?
an actionable
Well, I wouldn't say I had a
strategy.
lot of top
You'll
10 hits,
discover
or I
why
would
deep
still be
expertise
in
actually
music.
creates noise and how
But I was
story
able to work
clarifies
on
it.
some albums that
The
made
4
it
audience
into
types
the
that
top
should
10, and I
reshape
was
every
working as
high-stakes
a
conversation,
producer
and the
and songwriter.
communication grid that
Primarily
turns your
production
story
was my
into
passion.
an
And that's actually why I
actionable
call myself a
strategy.
strategic
You'll
story producer,
discover
because
why
I see
deep
what I do now as
expertise
being
actually
very
creates noise
analogous to what I
and
did
how
back then.
story clarifies
Songwriters and
it.
artists would come
The
to me
4
with
audience
this
types that should
long,
reshape
jumbled up
every high-stakes
thing of a
conversation,
song
and the
with no hook.
communication
It
grid
was
that
too much
turns your
information in the
story
beginning,
into an
and I would have to help
actionable
them
strategy.
turn it
You'll
into something
discover
which they
why
could
deep
communicate with
expertise
their
actually
audience
creates
with.
noise and how story
And
clarifies
that's why
it.
I've kind of
The 4
retained
audience
this
types that should
title, I
reshape
suppose,
every
of
high-stakes
producer.
conversation,
But big production
and the
was always something
communication grid that
I
turns
wanted
your
to
story
do
into an
ever since I was
actionable
a teenager,
strategy.
basically.
You'll discover
And
why
as a
deep
teenager, I got
expertise
very
actually
into
creates
making
noise
music, into
and how
DJing music as
story
well.
clarifies it.
And I think it
The
comes
4 audience
from
types that should reshape every
A, a love of
high-stakes
music.
conversation,
B,
and the
that
communication
kind of
grid that turns
eternal
your
search
story
for
into
order
an
in
actionable strategy.
the mess that people
You'll discover why
present to
deep
you, and being able to
expertise
present
actually
things in
creates
a way which
noise
is
and how
simpler and more
story
engaging.
clarifies it.
And
The 4 audience types that
I
should
had the
reshape
chance to work
every
with some amazing
high-stakes
people
conversation,
when I worked
and
in the music industry. It taught
communication
me a lot
grid that
about
turns your
that
story
process.
into an
And
actionable
part of the process
strategy.
is the skill
You'll
itself,
discover
your
why
feeling that
deep
you have
expertise
to
actually creates
portray
noise
music, compose,
and how
so
story
on.
clarifies
But then a lot of it is also how you
the
work
four
with
audience
the
types
artists
that should
themselves.
reshape
And
every
all of it has
high-stakes
been
conversation
relevant to
and the
what I do
communication
today
grid that turns
with my
your
work with
story
storytelling.
into an
And
actionable
the tech thing,
strategy.
I would say
You'll discover why deep
primarily when I
expertise
started,
actually
it
creates
was
noise
really all
and how
tech,
story
and that is
clarifies it.
because
The
of where
four
I am.
audience
'Cause
types that
Berlin
should reshape
has a huge
every
tech scene,
high-stakes
and that was what I was able to
conversation
break into
and the
when I first
communication
started this.
grid that turns
It's
your
opened up a
story
little bit
into an
since then, and I'm
actionable
working with
strategy.
a lot more
You'll discover
areas
why
and
deep
industries,
expertise
but
actually
tech was
creates
where it started.
noise and how story
Yeah, well, we have
clarifies
that
it.
music in common
The four
because I
audience
studied
types
music
that should
composition and
reshape
theory,
every
and now I find
high-stakes
myself teaching
conversation
story
and the
composition and theory
communication grid
for
that turns
branding,
your
you know,
story
business leadership,
into an
and so
actionable
forth.
strategy.
So tell us a
You'll
little bit
discover
about
why
your
deep
approach
expertise actually creates
as a music
noise
producer
and how
in the tech
story
world, helping
clarifies it.
founders and
The four
tech,
audience types that
brilliant
should
people
reshape
tell their
every
story.
high-stakes conversation
So,
and the communication grid that
the
turns your story
center,
into
and I
an
think
actionable
core
strategy.
of effective
You'll discover
communication,
why
'cause
deep
I guess this is
expertise
really
actually
what it's
creates
about, is how do you
noise
communicate
and how
what you're doing
story
to the people who
clarifies
matter.
it. The four
The
audience
real
types that
center
should
is
reshape
around
every
what is the
high-stakes
action or the outcome that we're
conversation
trying to
and the communication
elicit
grid that
from any
turns
piece of
your story
communication.
into an
There's a wonderful
actionable
quote by
strategy.
a former US
You'll
Navy SEAL
discover
called
why
Mike
deep
Hayes,
expertise
who's a
actually
crisis
creates
consultant,
noise
and
and
he
how
said that all
story
communication that isn't
clarifies it.
actionable
The
is
four
just
audience
noise,
types
and that's
that
something
should
which was
reshape
always stuck
every
with me,
high-stakes
because we have
conversation
the problem
and
is
the
not
communication
that we don't
grid
have
that
enough
turns
information.
your
Let's
story
be honest,
into an
particularly in the
actionable
tech world,
strategy.
but all industries,
You'll discover
basically,
why
there's
deep
too
expertise
much
actually
information, there's
creates
too much
noise
data.
and
How do we turn
story
that into
clarifies
something
it.
which is
The four audience
actually
types that should
actionable,
reshape
which
every
drives
high-stakes
whatever project you're
conversation
in forward?
and the
How do we
communication
make sure that
grid
it
that
turns
turns
into
your
something?
story
So
into an
I work
actionable
with people to work out
strategy.
how we can
You'll
approach that.
discover why deep expertise
and this will
actually
involve
creates
a
noise
few steps.
and how story
Their own goals
clarifies it.
and understanding
The
them
four
and being
audience
really clear.
types that should reshape
But then tying those
every
goals to
high-stakes
who they're actually dealing with
conversation
and who they're talking
and the
to.
communication grid
They
that turns
need to
your
understand what
story
kind of audience
into
they're
an
talking to and
actionable
what category
strategy.
of audience
You'll
you might
discover
have.
why deep
I like
expertise
to
actually
break down
creates
audiences
noise
into
and how
4 types,
story
and
clarifies
this is
it.
not
The
my
four
own
audience types that should
framework.
reshape
This is actually the
every
work of a guy called
high-stakes
Connor Neal, who
conversation and the
wonderful
communication
leadership
grid that
communication
turns
expert.
your story
He says that the
into
4
an
types of audience
actionable
are
strategy.
friendly,
You'll
adversarial,
discover why deep
apathetic,
expertise actually
and
creates noise
uneducated.
and how story
So friendly
clarifies
means they
it.
like you, they like
The
your
four
ideas.
audience types that
You're going to
should
be able to
reshape
go a long way with
every
that.
high-stakes
Adversarial,
conversation
they
and
don't
the
like you, they don't like your
communication grid
idea.
that turns
So
your
therefore, you're
story
not going to be
into
able
an
to
actionable
achieve as much
strategy.
with your communication.
You'll discover why
However,
deep
what you can do is
expertise
maybe
actually
get them
creates
to
noise
question
and how
their
story
preconceptions.
clarifies it.
An
The four
apathetic
audience
audience
types that should reshape
don't care and
every
don't see why it
high-stakes
matters to them.
conversation and the
For them,
communication
you need to help
grid
them
that
see
turns
themselves
your
in the
story
problem.
into an
And then
actionable
for an uneducated
strategy.
audience, that doesn't mean
You'll
that
discover why
they're
deep
stupid.
expertise
It just
actually
means that
creates
they do not
noise
understand
and
what
how
you are talking
story
about.
clarifies
Therefore,
it.
they require a
The
certain
four
amount
audience
of
types that should
education
reshape every
in order
high-stakes
to
conversation
be
and the
able to take action
communication
on the
grid
things
that
that
turns
you're
your
talking about.
story into an
And
actionable
the last
strategy.
thing that I do
You'll
in this
discover
kind of
why deep
initial stage where we're
expertise actually
trying to
creates noise
unpick
and how story
action
clarifies
is
it.
really try and
The
map
four
out who we're
audience
talking
types
to.
that should
And there's a
reshape
few ways you
every
can do it, but one of the
high-stakes
simplest ones is to
conversation and the
use 2
communication
axes
grid that
of
turns your story
interest
into an
and power.
actionable strategy.
So how
You'll
much
discover
interest
why
do they
deep
have
expertise
in
actually creates
you and your
noise
project,
and how
and
story clarifies
how much
it.
can they actually
The four audience
make something
types
happen?
that
So of
should
course,
reshape every
we wouldn't spend our
high-stakes
time trying to
conversation
communicate with people
and the
who didn't
communication
care
grid
and
that
didn't have
turns
any
your
power to make
story
anything happen.
into an
What we
actionable
want to ideally
strategy.
do is talk to people who
You'll
do
discover
care
why
and
deep
do have
expertise
power to make
actually
things
creates
happen.
noise and how
So
story
that's really
clarifies
that
it. The four audience
is not
types
really
that
the
should
storytelling
reshape
part, but I
every
find once
high-stakes
you need to go
conversation
through that in
and
order
the
for the stories to
communication
kind of
grid that
make
turns
sense
your story
and to be
into
valuable
an
and achieve the kind
actionable
of outcome.
strategy.
Does that make sense?
You'll
what I'm
discover
saying?
why
I mean,
deep
I totally,
expertise actually creates
apply
noise
it to your
and
business or
how
your music
story
world, where you've got to
clarifies it.
understand
The four
what kind of
audience
audience
types
are
that
you
should reshape shape
producing
every
form.
high-stakes
The
conversation.
artist could show
and
up
the
with great music,
communication
whatever,
grid
but
that turns
maybe
your
they're thinking
story
it's
into
country
an
and western, and you're
actionable
like, no, actually, this is
strategy.
much more pop.
You'll discover why deep
So you have to really
expertise
get that
actually
understood
creates
first.
noise,
And that was something I really struggled
story
with
clarifies
because
it.
when I was in my
The
early
four audience
20s,
types
this
that
might
should
be the
reshape
reason that I didn't make it as far in
high-stakes
music as I
conversation
wanted
and the
to.
communication grid
But I
that
was-
turns your story
I wanted to be
into
cool.
an
I wanted to make cool
actionable
music, you know?
strategy.
This is why I
You'll
got
discover
into it.
why deep
I had a particular
expertise
sound
actually
that I
creates
wanted to get
noise
across.
and how
And I think
story
too often
clarifies it.
I
The four
got,
audience
when you
types
work
that should
in
reshape
production or
every
in
high-stakes
songwriting, you often get these
conversation and the
sheets,
communication
these
grid that
briefings
turns
from
your
record
story
labels.
into an
And they tell you kind of who we're
actionable
talking to, what the
strategy.
audience are, what they
You'll
like, what
discover
the
why deep
references are.
expertise actually
And I would
creates
find it
noise
so hard
and
to stick
how
to the
story
references
clarifies
to
it. The four
what I
audience
felt
types that
wasn't
should
cool,
reshape every
essentially.
high-stakes
And
conversation
I think that
and the
the
communication
times when I was
grid
able
that turns
to,
your
the
story
times when
into
I
an
was disciplined
actionable
enough to
strategy.
focus on the
You'll
audience and
discover
not
why
think about
deep
myself and
expertise
what
actually
I thought
creates
was cool.
noise
That
and
was
how
when I
story
was able to actually
clarifies
have
it.
some success
The
with
four audience
the
types
stuff
that
that I
should
created.
reshape every
the whole
high-stakes
storytelling
conversation
storytelling
and the
action that
communication
your story
grid
is
that
not about
turns
you,
your
but it's about
story
your audience
into
from
an
their point of view.
actionable
And
strategy.
why do they care? How do
You'll
you make
discover
them
why
care? And
deep
so if you look through
expertise
those
actually
four,
creates noise.
you got the friendly
and
audience,
how
meaning you
story
really understand them.
clarifies
They
it.
understand
The
you.
four audience
And so
types
that's
that should
much
reshape
easier sell.
every high-stakes
Then you got the
conversation
adversarial
and
that
the communication
may not
grid
completely
that turns
understand
your
the
story
product or service,
into an
or do
actionable
understand the product or
strategy.
service and really push
You'll
back
discover why
on it.
deep
I see that a lot
expertise
with
actually
AI.
creates
And you know
noise
what we're doing
and
with
how
the StoryCycle
story
Genie is saying, oh, it's
clarifies it.
AI.
The
It
four
can't be any
audience
good. They're
types
very
that should reshape
adversarial
every
towards it. And you
high-stakes
have to say, no,
conversation
actually
and
stop
the
thinking about it as
communication grid
artificial
that turns
intelligence.
your
Think
story
about it as
into an
artful
actionable
intelligence, or as a
strategy. You'll
as a
discover why deep
guest I had on
expertise
Bruno
actually
Sarda a
creates
couple weeks
noise
ago said,
and
you know,
how
he
story
views AI as
clarifies it.
augmented
The four
intelligence,
audience
that it
types that
augments
should
your own
reshape
intelligence,
every
but arguments
high-stakes
that you
conversation
could use to overcome
and
an
the
adversarial
communication grid that
audience.
turns
You
your
got
story
apathetic who just
into
don't
an
give a crap,
actionable
whatever.
strategy.
And maybe
you'll discover
maybe,
why deep expertise
you
actually
recognize
creates
them and you don't deal
noise
with them. I
and
don't know.
how
I'd be
story
curious to hear how you
clarifies
deal
it.
with an apathetic
The four
audience. And then,
audience
of course, the
types that should
uneducated,
reshape
they don't even
every
realize you have a
high-stakes
solution for them
conversation and the
until you
communication
can very
grid that turns your
concisely
story
tell that
into
story,
an
again,
actionable
from their
strategy.
point of view.
You'll
what's
discover
in it
why
for
deep
them.
expertise actually creates
So
noise.
you're making me
and
think
how
of a
story
wonderful book by
clarifies
David
it.
McRaney
The
called
four
How
audience
Minds
types that
Change.
should reshape every
And
high-stakes
it's a book about
conversation
persuasion
and the
and about
communication
conflict,
grid
really.
that turns your
And
story
the-
into an actionable
Similarly
strategy.
to, I'm sure,
You'll
things
discover
that
why
lots of
deep
guests have spoken
expertise
about,
actually
it
creates noise
basically
and how
disproves
story
the
clarifies it.
information deficit
The
model.
four
that
audience types
people
that
just
should
don't know
reshape
things, and if
every
you gave them the
high-stakes
facts, then they'd be able to see the world
and the
as you do.
communication
It's just
grid that
been
turns
disproven
your
and is known
story
to not be right.
into an
But
actionable
it goes a little bit beyond
strategy.
that. It says that
You'll discover
when you're
why
trying to
deep
change someone's
expertise
mind,
actually
you
creates
can't really
noise
do it
and how
there
story
and then
clarifies
if they are
it.
naturally
The four
resistant
audience
to you.
types that should reshape
Rather,
every
what you need to
high-stakes
try and do
conversation and the
is engineer a
communication grid
situation
that
where they
turns your
convince
story
themselves
into
in
an
between
actionable
interactions.
strategy.
And you do
You'll
this by getting
discover
them
why
to
deep expertise
look at their
actually
own
creates
preconceptions
noise and how
and try and
story
understand where those
clarifies it.
preconceptions
The
come
four
from.
audience types
Because,
that should
to use
reshape
your example,
every
artificial
high-stakes
intelligence,
conversation
people have a
and the
positive or a
communication
negative
grid that
view
turns
of
your
it
story into
from
an
somewhere,
actionable
who knows
strategy.
where.
You'll
And we've
discover
probably
why
never
deep
really thought
expertise
about why
actually
we have
creates
that point of
noise
view.
and how story
But once you can begin to
clarifies it.
unpick, and it's usually
The
through
four
listening,
audience
actually,
types that should reshape
once you can
every
begin to unpick
high-stakes
that,
conversation
then you have
and
the
the
opportunity
communication
to begin
grid that
changing
turns
someone's
your
mind. And
story
that's
into
where
an
the strategic
actionable
element comes in.
strategy.
One thing I
You'll
love to do
discover
with
why deep
my clients
expertise
is
actually
we map
creates
out a
noise and
communication
how
strategy. I
story
use
clarifies it.
a technique
four
or a
audience
framework
types that
which
should
was
reshape
originally
every
designed for the
high-stakes
UK government.
conversation
It's called the
and
Downing
the
Street Grid
communication
after 10
grid that
Downing
turns
Street,
your story
seat of
into
the
an
British Prime
actionable
Minister.
strategy.
And it was created by Alastair
You'll
Campbell in the
discover why deep
1990s. Alastair
expertise
Campbell
actually
was the
creates
communications
noise
officer
and
for
how
Tony Blair.
story
Very, very
clarifies
successful.
it.
And
The
has a
four
great
audience
podcast,
types
actually,
that
called
should
The Rest
reshape
is Politics.
every
But
high-stakes
maybe that's not interesting if you're not from the
conversation
UK.
and the communication grid
but
that turns your
what they
story
did with
into
it
an
was they
actionable
mapped out
strategy. You'll discover why
the
deep expertise actually
months
creates
of the
noise
year into
and how
weeks.
story clarifies
And they would,
it.
in each week,
The
they
four
would
audience types that
one
should
row,
reshape
which was
every
these are the major
high-stakes
events, the major
conversation,
things that
and
are
the
happening in the
communication
world
grid
each
that
week, or the
turns
major
your story
policy
into
changes,
an
or the things that
actionable
need to be announced.
strategy. You'll
then
discover
beneath
why
that,
deep
you would map,
expertise actually
this is going to be our
creates
story.
noise
This is
and
where we're
how
going to engage
story
people. These are the
clarifies it.
smaller
The
events
four
that we're going
audience
to try
types
and
that should
promote.
reshape
Just so
every
everything
high-stakes conversation
is aligned.
and the
And
communication
of course,
grid that turns
as
your
Alastair Campbell
story
said, you
into
cannot
an actionable
necessarily
strategy. You'll discover why deep
guarantee that the
expertise
press
actually
is going to
creates
talk about the
noise
things that
and
you
how
want to.
story
But
clarifies
what this can
it.
do is
The
it can get
four
lots
audience
of
types
people
that should reshape
aligned on what
every
they're going to say
high-stakes
at the right
conversation
time.
and the
And that
communication
is a really
grid
important
that turns
thing. And
your story into an
this
actionable
storytelling isn't magic.
strategy.
You can't
You'll
guarantee that
discover
you're
why
going
deep
to change
expertise
people's
actually
minds, but
creates noise
having that
and how
strategic
story
path
clarifies it.
forward gives you a
The
much better
four
chance, I
audience
think.
types that should
Give
reshape
us an
every
example of
high-stakes
your approach
conversation
with one of
and the
your
communication
clients,
grid that
customers,
turns your story
and
into an
what problem they
actionable
came to you
strategy.
with, and
You'll
how
discover
you
why
worked them
deep
through
expertise
your
actually
process,
creates
and
noise
right down to
and how
which one of
story
those four
clarifies
audiences
it.
were you
The
really
four audience
focused on.
types that should reshape
Okay,
every
so
high-stakes
exciting
conversation
project which I'm
and the
involved with at the moment
communication
is
grid that turns
a
your
digital
story
tools team in
into
a
an
large
actionable
pharmaceutical company
strategy.
which has just been created.
You'll discover why
And
deep
they are
expertise actually
essentially
creates
bringing
noise
this
and how story
corporate behemoth
clarifies
into
it.
the AI
The four audience
generation,
types that
and
should
giving the
reshape every
developers and the
high-stakes
technology
conversation
department the
and the
tools that they need to be
communication
able to
grid
make
that
use of
turns
this
your
amazing new
story
technology.
into an actionable
The challenge, though, is that it's
strategy.
absolutely
You'll
massive,
discover
this
why
company,
deep expertise
and
actually
getting
creates
anyone to do
noise
anything
and
is
how
really, really hard.
story
It takes lots of
clarifies
time.
it. The four
Similarly,
audience
you have
types that should
stakeholders internally,
reshape every
people at the top,
high-stakes
the
conversation
big cheeses
and the
who you need to
communication
be brought
grid that
into
turns your story
project
into
because
an
they're the ones who
actionable
are deciding whether you get
strategy.
resources for
You'll
it or
discover
not.
why deep expertise
So
actually
it's a
creates
lot.
noise
It's quite complex
and how
in order to
story
get a story
clarifies
across in
it.
that kind of
The
environment.
four
Because you've got
audience
lots of
types
different
that should
stakeholders.
reshape
You've got
every
the
high-stakes
big
conversation
cheeses, the leadership
and the
who need to see the
communication grid
impact.
that turns
You've
your
got the technical
story
teams who
into
want
an
to use your
actionable
new tools,
strategy.
and many of them are
You'll
maybe thinking,
discover
actually,
why
I don't
deep
really want to do it
expertise
because I've got my
actually
way of doing
creates
things.
noise and how
You've got
story
the
clarifies
various
it.
different product
The
teams
four
throughout the
audience types
organization
that
who
should
need to
reshape
actually
every
hear about
high-stakes
what you're doing
conversation
because it's so
and the
big that maybe they won't
communication
even hear
grid
about
that
it.
turns your story
So what we had to do
into
with
an
this is
actionable
it's a mixture of
strategy.
things. We
You'll
needed to
discover why
first of all
deep expertise
map out and
actually
understand
creates noise
each of
and how
the
story
products that they
clarifies
had.
it.
They brought out
The
these
four audience
various
types that
tools,
should reshape
and we needed
every
to hold workshops to
high-stakes
really understand what
conversation and
they
the
were.
communication
Creating
So
grid
this
that turns
communication
your
is happening
story
all
into an
in-house then.
actionable
This is
At this
happening
strategy.
all in-house.
Yeah.
Exactly.
You'll discover why deep
that's not always the
expertise
case with my
actually
work,
creates
but
noise
in this
and
particular
how
case, it
story
was an
clarifies
internal
the four
communication.
audience
But,
types
I
that
mean,
should
it's so big
reshape
and so
every
international that
high-stakes
we're talking about a lot
conversation
of people here.
and the communication grid
But what we
that
had to
turns
do is,
your
first of all, we had
story
to
into an
generate
actionable
an understanding within the
strategy.
team
You'll discover
of
why
what
deep expertise
these
actually
tools
creates
were.
noise and
And that's
how
also not
story
really
clarifies it.
as
The
self-explanatory
four
that the
audience
whole
types
team
that should
themselves are going to
reshape
be
every
aligned around one
high-stakes
North Star.
conversation
But we
and
had
the
to
communication
hold a
grid
series
that
of
turns
workshops to
your
really
story
begin
into
to
an
get that
actionable
common understanding,
strategy. You'll
and then
discover why
engineer a
deep
way that
expertise actually
that
creates
understanding could grow
noise
deeper
and
over
how
time. So
story
you have a
clarifies
preliminary
it.
workshop with a
The
kind of
four
leadership
audience
team
types
of
that
this
should
digital tools
reshape
team.
every
You
high-stakes
define this is our
conversation
origin story,
and the
this is what the tool is
communication
for,
grid that
this is the
turns
problem
your
it
story
solves,
into
the
an
kind of stuff
actionable
that you would do in a
strategy.
storytelling
You'll
workshop,
discover
you know?
why deep expertise actually creates
But then
noise
what I wanted to
and
do
how
was, because there
story
were quite a few
clarifies it.
stakeholders, I
The four
wanted
audience
to
types
get
that should
stories
reshape
about this
every
really
high-stakes
circulating throughout the team.
conversation and the
And
communication
we started
grid that
creating
turns your
story
story
sharing
into an
sessions
actionable
where simple
strategy. You'll
prompts.
discover why deep
When was
expertise
a moment
actually
that you
creates
saw
noise
a
and how
client
story
achieve something, or
clarifies
sorry,
it.
internal
The four
stakeholders
audience
achieve something
types
with
that
one of
should
our
reshape
tools this
every
week.
high-stakes
They would tell that story, and then people
and the
would
communication
react to
grid
that, and
that
they would have a
turns your
conversation
story
around it.
into an
And what
actionable
you can do is you can
strategy.
capture all of those
You'll
transcripts,
discover
and
why
then with
deep
AI you can
expertise
begin
actually
to
creates
extract
noise
stories
and
which you
how
can then begin
story
to
clarifies it.
infuse into
The four audience
assets,
types
which
that
are going to
should
be
reshape
things like
every high-stakes conversation
PowerPoint
and the
decks,
communication
could be
grid that
little
turns
kind
your
of
story
TikTok-style
into an
videos
actionable
of things that you
strategy.
can do. And
You'll
the team were
discover
really
why
good at the
deep
technical
expertise
stuff,
actually
so they
creates
could even
noise
generate create like
and how
short animated
story
videos of the
clarifies
stuff
it.
that we were doing.
The four
in that.
audience types that should
And then you
reshape
have something like a
every
grid to
high-stakes
take all of these
conversation,
assets
and the
that are being
communication
produced
grid
and then
that turns your story
orchestrate it
into an
into a
actionable
clear release schedule.
strategy.
So you know
You'll
that the
discover
right
why
people are
deep
getting
expertise
updates on
actually
certain
creates
things at the right
noise
time.
and how
You're having
story
workshops
clarifies
with
it.
particular
four
groups of
audience
people,
types that should
educating
reshape
them
every
on the tools
high-stakes
and
conversation,
in a way
and the
that's aligned
communication
with
grid
that.
that turns
You have a
your
newsletter
story
that's going
into
out
an
to
actionable
one group of people,
strategy.
which tells them a
You'll
particular
discover
thing,
why deep
and everything
expertise
kind of
actually
flows.
creates noise, and
I
how
won't say that it
story
was a
clarifies
completely
it.
clean
The
and
four
seamless
audience
process.
types
It
that
was
should reshape
a bit messy
every
at times.
high-stakes
No, it never is.
conversation,
It was a
and
little
the
bit,
communication
messy,
grid that
and we're
turns
still
your
working
story
on it.
into
But
an
it's
actionable
certainly
strategy.
been very exciting.
You'll discover
to
why
work
deep
on.
expertise actually creates
So
noise,
yours is very
and
much
how
of
story
a strategic
clarifies it.
approach to
The
storytelling,
four audience
mapping it
types
out,
that
getting
should
your plan
reshape
in place, then
every
doing it.
high-stakes
Do you actually
conversation,
coach
and the
your
communication
clients then
grid
on
that
how
turns your
to tell those
story
stories
into
using
an
different frameworks and so
actionable
forth?
strategy?
Yeah, we do.
You'll discover
we
why
do.
deep
And
expertise
that would
actually
be,
creates
I think
noise,
it's not
and how
just telling
story
stories, but also
clarifies
spotting
it.
stories and
The four
understanding
audience
story
types that
and
should
being able to
reshape
think
every
in terms of
high-stakes
story.
conversation,
That's really the first
and the
step. And then being
communication
able to
grid
tell
that
a
turns
story,
your story
ensuring
into an
things.
actionable strategy.
These are all things that might
You'll
be obvious
discover
to
why deep
your
expertise
listeners, but
actually
maybe are not
creates
obvious to a
noise,
technical
and
team
how
in
story
the company.
clarifies it.
You know,
The four
being able
audience
to draw on a
types that
time and a
should reshape
place.
every
Have
high-stakes
a
conversation,
surprising
and the
event or
communication
turn.
grid that turns your story
Being
into
able
an
to have
actionable
identifiable
strategy.
characters.
You'll discover
Specific
why deep
moments that you can bring
expertise
to
actually
life.
creates noise,
This,
and how story
you kind of have
clarifies
to
it. The
educate
four audience
people
types that should
in.
reshape every
When I'm working
high-stakes
with
conversation,
individuals, though,
and the
some of my
communication
work was
grid
done
that
with
turns
individuals
your
there,
story
and we were
into an
creating
actionable
keynote
strategy.
slides or
You'll
presentations that
discover
they
why
would be
deep
giving. Then we
expertise
would
actually
go
creates
more
noise,
into like one
and how
individual story
story
and how we were going to
clarifies
get that
it.
across.
The four audience types
How do
that
you
should reshape
pry
every high-stakes
technologists out of their
conversation,
logic,
and the
reason
communication
brain?
grid
So,
that
for
turns
instance, I
your
was up in
story
Seattle over the
into an
weekend, and I
actionable
sat down with
strategy.
a very, very
You'll
brilliant
discover why deep
technologist who is,
expertise actually creates
coming
noise,
up with a
and
new
how
way to
story
work with
clarifies it.
transistors
The
in the
four audience
optical
types
realm.
that should reshape every
And he spent
high-stakes
40 minutes
conversation,
explaining to
and the
me all the
communication
science
grid
and the
that turns
technology and
your
how it works and
story
so forth.
into
And
an
it was all I could
actionable
do to hang on,
strategy.
Rob. I mean, I was just
You'll
like, what?
discover why
Yeah, I
deep
think I get it.
expertise
Okay,
actually
yeah, that kind
creates
of makes
noise,
sense, whatever.
and
And then
how story
when I finally
clarifies
started
it.
talking to him,
The four
I'm like,
audience
okay,
types that should
so
reshape
what?
every
I mean,
high-stakes
what does this mean to
conversation,
me, or
and the
more importantly, the
communication
funder,
grid that
he's
turns
looking
your
to-
story
And
into
I see
an
this all the time.
actionable
With
strategy.
technologists,
You'll
they just
discover
think
why deep
that
expertise
their
actually creates
technology is so
noise,
wonderful,
and
it's
how
going to sell
story
itself if
clarifies
they can
it.
simply
The four audience
describe
types that
how
should
it
reshape
works. And my
every
big
high-stakes
axiom is,
conversation,
not only is
and the
your
communication
audience the center of
grid
your
that
story,
turns
but
your
your story is not
story
about what you
into
make,
an
not
actionable
the technology,
strategy.
but what
You'll
that
discover why
technology
deep expertise
makes
actually
happen.
creates noise.
So
and
I
how
imagine you
story
probably come across
clarifies
this
it.
all the time too.
The
And
four
how do you
audience
get
types
them
that should reshape
to
every
change the way
high-stakes
they're viewing or
conversation,
communicating
and the
their
communication
technology?
grid that turns
I had a
your
communication.
story
I had
into an
a
actionable
conversation exactly like this.
strategy. You'll
About
discover
2
why
hours
deep
ago.
expertise actually creates
The one you're
noise,
describing.
and how story
and it doesn't come
clarifies it.
from a bad
The
place.
four
It comes
audience
from
types that should
their own
reshape
expertise,
every
their natural
high-stakes
enthusiasm, their
conversation,
desire to
and
help.
the communication grid that turns
But
your
I
story
wasn't
into
really
an
following him
actionable
after a while.
strategy. You'll discover
what I
why
wanted
deep
to do,
expertise
and
actually
I
creates
think
noise, and how
what the
story
key is
clarifies it.
to
The four
begin
audience
to
types
unpick
that should reshape
the
every
moments
high-stakes
that led
conversation,
this guy
and the communication
to create
grid
what he
that
did.
turns your
I wanted to
story
understand his
into an
background. I wanted to
actionable
understand the frustrations
strategy.
that he
You'll
had
discover why deep
and begin to
expertise
talk
actually
about it
creates
in that
noise,
way.
and how story
and
clarifies
talk
it.
about the
four audience
emotions that he
types that
felt
should
when he was
reshape
frustrated with
every
the old way
high-stakes
that he used to have to work.
conversation,
He
and the
previously had a
communication
government job,
grid that turns
and
your
he
story
had to
into
go at
an
a snail's
actionable
pace. He was so
strategy.
frustrated with not being
You'll
able to get
discover why
things
deep
done.
expertise actually creates noise.
And once we did that,
and
okay,
how
then we thought, all
story
right, so
clarifies it.
how is
The
your
four
tool,
audience
your
types
widget,
that should reshape
changing
every
that?
high-stakes
What is the impact
conversation,
that it is actually
and the
creating?
communication grid that
And
turns your story
once you
into
walk
an
people through
actionable
this process,
strategy.
this is
You'll
how things used
discover
to be.
why deep
This is the
expertise actually
frustration that
creates
I felt,
noise,
that
and
others
how
felt, that I
story
saw.
clarifies it.
This is how
The
it
four
solves
audience
that.
types
This is
that
how
should
it helps
reshape every
the audience
high-stakes
or
conversation,
the customer or
and
whatever it is,
communication
solve their
grid
problem.
that
And this
turns
is what
your
success
story
looks like.
into
Let's
an
break it down to
actionable
three-step
strategy.
story.
You'll discover why
3-act
deep
structure.
expertise
a simple
actually
3-act
creates
structure.
noise and how
Then
story
suddenly they're like, yeah, that's
clarifies
it. That's what I
the
do.
4 audience types that
And
should
suddenly they
reshape
feel
every
this
high-stakes
weight lifted
conversation
from them. There's
and
this
the
clarity to
communication
it,
grid that turns your
which
story
wasn't there
into
before.
an
And,
actionable strategy.
I don't know if you ever get this
You'll
feeling.
discover why
you're
deep
kind of thinking
expertise
sometimes
actually
like,
creates noise.
did I do anything just
and
then? I
how
feel like I just
story
used a
clarifies
very
it.
simple structure
The 4
and just
audience types that should
they
reshape
did all the
every
work,
high-stakes
but now it's a lot
conversation
clearer.
and the communication grid
and-
that turns your
and
story
I think if
into
you
an
can
actionable
let people
strategy.
go through that process,
You'll
then they see
discover
the
why
value of
deep
it,
expertise
generally.
actually creates noise.
And Rob, that's where,
and how
in fact, I
story
used it on this
clarifies
gentleman
it.
I was having
The
coffee
4
at a
audience
Starbucks
types
with,
that
and
should
you
reshape
shared with him the
every
and but therefore, which is
high-stakes
very much of what you're
conversation
talking
and the
about.
communication
And all I
grid
did is
that
after
turns
40
your
minutes of
story
listening to this,
into an
I just
actionable
repeated back,
strategy.
okay, so
You'll
let me
discover
know if
why
I've got
deep
this
expertise
right.
actually creates
You know,
noise and how story
This is the
clarifies
current
it.
state of
The 4
affairs,
audience types that
and
should
it's been
reshape
working
every
this,
high-stakes conversation
in this way
and the
because of this
communication grid
technology
that turns your
fairly
story
successful.
into an
But
actionable
there's a lot of things
strategy.
it
You'll
cannot
discover
do
why
that it
deep
needs to
expertise
do
actually creates
because
noise
of this
and how
particular
story
component is far
clarifies it.
too large.
The 4 audience
Therefore,
types that should
you
reshape
have
every high-stakes
redesigned how
conversation
this chip could
and the
be
communication
made to make
grid
this
that turns
component
your
way
story
smaller
into an
and it has
actionable
applications
strategy.
across numerous
You'll discover why
industries.
deep expertise
Do I have that
actually
right?
creates noise
He's going, yeah,
and how
that's
story
pretty much it.
clarifies
But
it.
it's the
The
and but
4
therefore.
audience types
This is
that
the
should
current
reshape every
situation, and
high-stakes
it's
conversation
fairly effective because
and the
of this.
communication
But
grid that turns
it's
your
not
story
effective here
into an
because of this
actionable
major problem.
strategy.
Therefore, you have
You'll
a fix
discover
for it.
why deep expertise actually creates noise and how
it's what great
story
salespeople do
clarifies
as well.
it. The
And
4
I think
audience types
for
that
us,
should
I guess it
reshape
comes intuitively
every
because we do it all the
high-stakes
time. We're
conversation
used to
and
breaking
the
things down into these
communication grid
structures.
that turns
But
your
then
story
when you're
into
coming
an
across it for the first
actionable
time,
strategy.
like this
You'll
person you were
discover
talking
why
to,
deep expertise actually
it feels like
creates
magic
noise
because suddenly
and
there's
how
so much clarity
story
to it.
clarifies it.
Yeah, and it's
The
like
4
I
audience
said to him
types
too.
that
I said,
should
Einstein
reshape
said
every
it best: is make it
high-stakes
simple, but
conversation
no
and the
simpler.
communication grid
Well, the
that
and but
turns
therefore,
your
if you can
story
get so when you were
into
saying
an
earlier that
actionable
it seems so
strategy.
simple
You'll
from
discover
our
why deep
perspective, the
expertise
storyteller
actually creates
perspective, because
noise
we've worked
and
on
how
it.
story
You come from music
clarifies it.
producing. I come
The
from
4
music
audience
composition
types that
theory.
should
It's all about
reshape
taking a
every
complex idea,
high-stakes
making it simple,
conversation
giving it a
and the
hook so that everybody in
communication
the room is
grid that
going
turns
to
your story
appreciate that.
into an actionable
and I really love what you
strategy.
said.
You'll
Is it's
discover
coming
why
from a
deep
good
expertise
place.
actually
These
creates
technologists
noise
are
and how
literally
story
trying to change the
clarifies
world,
it.
to
The
save the
4
world, to
audience
do
types that should
whatever.
reshape
They
every
just get in their
high-stakes
own intellect,
conversation
gets in their
and the
own way.
communication grid that
Yes.
turns your
And
story
usually they
into
have a
an
vast intellect as
actionable
well,
strategy.
which also doesn't really
You'll
help
discover
because
why deep
they're talking
expertise
about
actually
something
creates
really
noise
complicated.
and how story
There is, I mean,
clarifies it.
there's
The 4
three
audience
types
types
of
that
complexity
should
as far as I
reshape
understand.
every
There's the
high-stakes
intrinsic,
conversation
extraneous,
and the
and
communication
germane. And this
grid
is
that
how you
turns
can
your
break down
story
complexity
into
for
an actionable strategy.
Things
You'll discover
be
why deep
intrinsically
expertise actually creates
complex
noise
or simple.
and how
If
story
I'm trying to explain how a
clarifies
large
it.
language
The
model
4 audience
works,
types that should
that's more
reshape
complex
every
than explaining to
high-stakes
someone how to use a toaster.
conversation and the
It's gonna be
communication
more
grid that
complex.
turns your story
the
into an
extraneous
actionable
part of
strategy.
complexity is how
You'll
you actually
discover why
describe it
deep
to people.
expertise actually creates noise and how story
We
clarifies
value
it.
people
the 4
who are
audience
able to
types
simplify
that should
complex
reshape
things.
every high-stakes
The best speakers in the
conversation
world
and the communication grid
speak
that
at a
turns
relatively
your
low
story
readability score.
into an
Doesn't mean that their
actionable
ideas
strategy.
are
You'll
simple.
discover why deep
These ideas
expertise
might be very
actually
complex,
creates noise
but they're using
and
simple
how
words to
story
describe them.
clarifies it.
And they're not
The
overloading
4
their
audience
audience
types that
at
should
any one
reshape
moment.
every high-stakes conversation
germane,
and the
this is how
communication
you
grid that
sow the
turns your
seeds of
story
understanding
into
in
an
people. You give
actionable
them a framework
strategy.
within which
You'll
to
discover why deep
understand
expertise
something.
actually creates
And then
noise
it can,
and how story
like the name kind of
clarifies it.
suggests, it kind of
The 4
grows out of their
audience
mind once
types
they
that
have
should
a
reshape
map to
every
orient
high-stakes
them
conversation
their way around the
and the
idea.
communication grid
Okay,
that
Rob,
turns
give us
your
another
story
example.
into an
How have you
actionable
done this for
strategy.
a client of yours?
You'll discover why deep
Let's have
expertise
a
actually
thing.
creates
I mean,
noise
just a
and how
very
story
basic
clarifies it.
version
The 4
is
audience
a
types insights that should
bank
reshape
board member
every
who I was working
high-stakes
with quite a bit for a
conversation
few months.
and the community communication
And
grid
he
that
was
turns your story
speaking
into an
in
actionable
all hands
strategy.
meetings to lots of people.
You'll discover why
And
deep expertise
his
actually
challenge
creates
was
noise
that
and
he'd have
how
to prepare and
story
prepare and prepare, and it
clarifies
would take him forever.
The four audience
and he would get
types that should
into
reshape
these meetings
every
and start
high-stakes
talking,
conversation,
and he'd
the
forget everything he
communication
prepared,
grid that
and he
turns
would
your story
just
into an
stop meandering
actionable
and talking
strategy.
about this or that. People
You'll
couldn't really follow
discover
what he was
why
talking
deep
about.
expertise actually creates
And
noise
he came up with this
and how
wonderful analogy,
story
which I think sums it up.
clarifies it.
He says, it's
The
like
four audience types that should
I'm
reshape
using sand
every
rather than
high-stakes
stones.
conversation.
I'm starting
and
with all these little bits
communication grid
rather
that
than the
turns
big
your
building
story
blocks.
into an
And
actionable
the simplest thing that we could
strategy.
do was
You'll
just
discover
break
why
down
deep
these simple
expertise
structures,
actually creates
give him
noise
the kind
and
of
how story
architecture
clarifies it.
of the house,
four
the kind
audience
of
types that
structural,
should reshape
you can
every
call it the
high-stakes
scaffolding or whatever it might
conversation,
be, the
and the
stuff that you hang the
communication
data
grid
off.
that turns your story
And then he was
into
able
an
to
actionable
not only be
strategy.
clear in how he was speaking,
You'll
but
discover
feel more
why deep
confident as
expertise
well,
actually creates
and
noise
not
and how
forget what he wanted to
story
say, because he
clarifies
had a simple
the
structure
four
that he
audience
could go
types
through.
that should
He didn't
reshape
need to use
every
endless notes.
high-stakes conversation, and the
It was because he had
communication grid
structure.
that
I think
turns your
structure
story
really is
into
the
an
key to all of
actionable
this.
strategy.
I think it's
You'll discover
kind of
why
why
deep
storytelling
expertise
exists.
actually
Is
creates
the world is
noise
too complex
and how
to
story
define. There
clarifies
is
it. The four audience types
fact,
that
there
should
is
reshape
data
every
out there,
high-stakes
but
conversation,
there's so much of it
and the
that we
communication
cannot
grid
make
that
sense of
turns
it.
your
So that's why we
story
create stories,
into an
to make sense of
actionable
our world around us.
strategy. You'll discover why
Yeah,
deep
I just had that
expertise actually
experience. I do a
creates
lot of
noise
work with the
and
U.S.
how
Air Force and
story
their leadership,
clarifies
and
it. The four audience
recently doing
types
a lot
that
with
should
their
reshape
research
every
labs.
high-stakes
And I was,
conversation,
training
and the
14 of
communication
their
grid that
folks
turns
that are
your
on the front
story
line of the
into
research
an
labs that go to
actionable
Congress
strategy.
to get funding and
You'll
so forth.
discover why
And they
deep
said one of their
expertise
biggest
actually
challenges
creates
was they had to
noise
follow
and
a
how
very
story
strict guideline on
clarifies
how
it.
they would present
The four audience
to
types that
Congress
should
people.
reshape
But
every
then the Congress
high-stakes
people lob a
conversation,
grenade in there
and the
and try to throw them off,
communication
and they would
grid
get
that
thrown
turns
off
your
because then
story
they were going down
into
this
an
rabbit hole, that rabbit
actionable
hole.
strategy.
They couldn't get to their
You'll
point,
discover why
and
deep
then their time
expertise
was up.
actually creates
And
noise
just
and
literally
how
taking them
story
through the ambit,
clarifies it.
therefore
The four
structure
audience
to
types
get
that should
very
reshape
focused on a
every
singular problem
high-stakes
solution that you're
conversation,
communicating,
and the
and then
communication
following that
grid that
structure,
turns
so
your
when
story
those hand
into an
grenades come in,
actionable
they can
strategy.
definitely
You'll discover why
answer
deep
that question
expertise
for that
actually
congressman, but
creates
get
noise
themselves right
and
back
how
in
story
that story
clarifies
structure
it.
of the ambit.
The four audience types that should
and it's not
reshape
just the Air
every
Force, is it? I think it's
high-stakes
anyone who's got
conversation, and the
Exactly.
a office
communication
job
grid that
is going to
turns
be
your
talking
story
to
into
an
an
executive
actionable
who's impatient
strategy.
and interrupts
You'll discover why
and
deep
throws that hand
expertise
grenade in
actually
there.
creates noise,
And then they've got to
and
somehow
how
get
story
back on track
clarifies it.
and get the point
The four
across and
audience
get some sort of
types that
action
should
to be
reshape
taken.
every
And
high-stakes conversation,
whether you want to use ambit
and the
therefore or
communication
a
grid
3-act
that
structure
turns
or
your story
SCQA or
into an
whatever it is, they all
actionable
kind of do the same
strategy.
thing.
You'll
They do.
discover why
They're
deep
giving a
expertise
simple
actually
structure
creates
that people can
noise
understand
and
and
how
make sense
story
of.
clarifies
Yeah, because
it.
the ABT
The
is
four
a
audience
3-act
types
structure,
that should
set up
reshape
problem resolution.
every
And
high-stakes
it's a way that
conversation,
I
and the
have determined
communication
that our
grid that turns
pattern-seeking,
your
problem-solving,
story into an
decision-making, buying
actionable
limbic
strategy.
brain wants to get
You'll
information.
discover why deep expertise
what's the
actually
current
creates
state?
noise
What's
and
the
how
state we want to
story
achieve, but
clarifies it.
why are
The
we
four
not
audience
achieving
types
that? What's the
should
gap we
reshape
have to
every
overcome? Therefore,
high-stakes
here's how we're going to
conversation,
achieve it
and
by
the
doing this.
communication grid that
It's
turns
the root
your
of telling a story, but also,
into
like,
an
if you think about
actionable strategy.
an effective negotiator
You'll
is doing
discover why
exactly the
deep
same thing as
expertise
well.
actually creates
Now, they're-
noise and how
think
story
about like the grow
clarifies
model,
it.
which
The
is
four
mostly used in
audience
coaching,
types
but I
that
kind of
should
think it
reshape
works for
every
negotiation too.
high-stakes conversation,
Goal, you understand,
and the
like, this is the goal, this is where we're
communication
trying to
grid
get
that
to.
turns your story
The reality,
into an
this is where we
actionable
are,
strategy.
and this is the difference that
You'll
we have.
discover why deep expertise
Options,
actually creates noise.
what are the different
and
ways
how
that we can
story
achieve our goal?
clarifies it.
And then you
The
establish a way
four
forward.
audience types that
It's
should reshape
also kind of
every
rooted in this
high-stakes
3-act structure.
conversation, and the
Absolutely
communication
is. I
grid
mean,
that
you and I
turns
have
your
not
story
reinvented
into an
anything.
actionable
this
strategy.
stuff has been around
You'll
since the
discover
beginning of
why
time.
deep
It's just
expertise
the
actually
packaging of it,
creates
depending
noise
on
and how
who your
story
audience is and
clarifies
who you were
it.
trying to help.
The
and
four
what they're
audience
trying
types
to
that should
accomplish. And so,
reshape
yeah,
every
all of it, that's that
high-stakes
tripartite
conversation,
structure of
and the
story,
communication
isn't it?
grid
It shows
that
up in
turns
lots of
your
different ways.
story
Let's go back
into
to the
an
music world.
actionable
1,
strategy.
4,
You'll discover why deep expertise actually
Basic
creates noise
tripart
and how
structure of the story. You start, on that one chord.
The 4 audience types that should reshape
give you the
every
key
high-stakes
that you're in. Then you go to the 4
and the
of that one
communication
chord,
grid that turns
and then
your
the 5
story
that wants
into
to be
an
resolved back
actionable
down
strategy.
to the one chord.
You'll
Well,
discover why
that's
deep
an and, but
expertise
therefore.
actually creates
That's,
noise
the
and how
tripartite structure of the story.
clarifies
Now, the
it.
really good
The
producers
4
and
audience
musicians
types
will
that
add
should
a lot
reshape
of
every
nuance to that.
high-stakes
But
conversation
you can
and
pretty
the
much follow that
communication
structure.
grid
The
that turns your
sonata allegro
story
form
into an
is,
actionable strategy.
You
You'll
introduce,
discover
you
why
develop
deep
the idea,
expertise
and then you
actually
resolve the
creates
idea
noise
at the end.
and
It's
how story
3-part structure of the
clarifies
story.
it.
To
The
me, I
4
just find
audience
it so
types that
interesting in
should
how our
reshape
brain
every
is just
high-stakes
automatically
conversation
wired to
and
take
the
in
communication
that
grid
kind of
that turns
communication
your
to make
story
sense of the world
into an
around us.
actionable strategy.
I guess
You'll discover why deep
perhaps
expertise actually
it
creates
is tied
noise
to
and how
the
story
number of
clarifies
things that
it.
our conscious
The
brain
4
can
audience types
really
that should
take
reshape
in at any one
every
time.
high-stakes
So,
conversation
in our
and
conscious
the
brain, our
communication
prefrontal
grid that
cortex,
turns your story
when we want to hold
into
an
an
idea in
actionable
our mind,
strategy.
it's basically
You'll
synapses
discover why
firing
deep expertise
our
actually
parts
creates
of our brain are
noise
firing together.
and
The
how
little connections are
story
being made.
clarifies it.
And you
The
can
4
have about
audience
3 to
types
5
that
of
should
these
reshape
connections at any one
every
time before they
high-stakes
start overwriting
conversation
each other.
and the
And then
communication
you
grid
lose
that
the thread.
turns your story
A story
into
gives
an
you enough of
actionable
these connections, of
strategy.
these
You'll
parts
discover
firing
why
up in
deep
your mind
expertise
to
actually
feel
creates
substantial
noise
and
and
give
how
direction.
story clarifies
But
it.
then not too
The
much
4 audience types
that
that
it
should
gets
reshape
lost.
every
Because there's no-
high-stakes conversation
I
and the
guess Joseph Campbell has
communication
his
grid that turns your
hero's
story
journey, but
into an actionable
I don't think most people are telling
strategy.
hero's journey
You'll
off the top of their
discover
heads.
why deep expertise actually creates noise
Usually
and
a
how
story we're talking about,
clarifies
these
it.
structures that
The
people
4
go to
audience
and
types
use a
that
lot
should
are
reshape
3 parts,
every
maybe
high-stakes
4.
conversation and the
certainly no more than
communication
5.
grid that turns your story
And I
into
find,
an
too,
actionable
in the
strategy.
communication
You'll
complex
discover why
subjects
deep
that our brain
expertise
is really
actually
a horrible
creates noise
multitasker.
and how
And so
story
to find that
clarifies it.
singular
The 4
problem
audience
solution
types
dynamic,
that should reshape
and as you were
every
telling that
high-stakes
anecdote about that
conversation
moment in
and the
time,
communication
find a
grid that
singular
turns your story
character that
into
this
an
story is
actionable
about. Yes, there are going to be some other people
You'll
maybe
discover
involved,
why deep
but like
expertise
Star Wars,
actually
for
creates
instance,
noise
that
and how
whole
story clarifies
story was
it.
about Luke Skywalker.
The 4 audience
He
types
had all
that
these
should
other people
reshape
in there, but
every
it was
high-stakes
truly
conversation
about Luke Skywalker.
and the communication
In fact, you
grid
might
that
find
turns
this
your
interesting if you
story
haven't read it
into
already.
an actionable
Nicholas Kristof,
strategy.
who is a
You'll
very
discover
famous,
why deep
writer for the New
expertise
York
actually
Times,
creates noise and
wrote
how
in
story
Outside
clarifies
Magazine
it.
a
The
great
4 audience
article
types
about
that should
advice for
reshape
saving the
every
world.
high-stakes
And if I
conversation
can pull it
and the
up again
communication
real quick
grid
here.
that
Yeah,
turns
Nicholas
your
Kristof's
story
advice
into
for
an
saving the
actionable
world.
strategy.
Search that.
You'll
and
discover
pull it
why
up,
deep
and
expertise
he
actually
talks
creates
about
noise
the
and how
power
story
of the
clarifies
singular
it.
narrative,
The 4 audience
singular
types that should
individual.
reshape
In this
every
case, it was about
high-stakes conversation
I never
and the
say that word.
communication
Darfur,
grid that turns your
raising
story
money
into
for
an
kids there,
actionable
and how
strategy.
much more success
You'll
they had
discover why deep
when
expertise
their
actually creates
communications
noise
would go
and how
out and would
story
highlight
clarifies
one
it.
child.
The 4
And then by
audience types
proxy,
that
that
should
one
reshape
child
every
represented
high-stakes
millions of kids
conversation
going through
and the
this.
communication
when
grid that
they
turns your
did
story
another mailing
into
and
an
they had 2
actionable
kids in that
strategy.
mailing, they
You'll
saw that
discover why
donations
deep
dropped by
expertise
50%.
actually creates noise
And his
how
argument
story
as a writer
clarifies
is
it.
stay
The
focused
4 audience
on
types
that
that should
singular
reshape
problem solution
every high-stakes
dynamic with a
conversation
singular
and the
character at the center of your
communication
story
grid that turns
your
your
audience can
story
relate to,
into an
and then by
actionable
proxy represents
strategy.
not only them,
You'll
but maybe
discover
an
why
entire
deep expertise
division,
actually creates noise
entire
and
organization
how
or
story
whatever.
clarifies it. The 4
You're making me
audience
think
types
of
that should
some
reshape
research done by Paul
every
Zak, who is
high-stakes conversation and
neuroscientist,
the communication
investigates
grid
the
that
idea of
turns
story.
your
You've had him on the show.
story
So
into an
dopamine,
actionable
cortisol,
strategy.
oxytocin, yeah.
You'll
Dr.
discover why
Love,
deep
which he got a lot of
expertise
shit
actually
for, by the way,
creates
but Dr.
noise
Love,
and
yeah.
how story clarifies
But I mean, the idea of
it.
dopamine,
The 4
cortisol,
audience types that
oxytocin,
should
it kind
reshape
of also
every
again
high-stakes
ties into these elements
conversation
of story.
and the
You have
communication
dopamine of
grid
the
that turns
anticipation,
your story into an
cortisol
actionable
of the tension that you
strategy.
get that needs
You'll
to be
discover why
resolved,
deep
and the
expertise actually
oxytocin of
creates
social
noise
bonding,
and how
identifying
story
with
clarifies
a
it.
character.
The 4
And
audience
story needs to
types
have
that
those
should
things
reshape
in it, or it doesn't
every
work.
high-stakes
And
conversation
perhaps
and the
music is the same
communication
thing. We
grid that
need to
turns
have
your
the
story
tension of the dominant chord
actionable
that is then resolved by the tonic.
You'll discover why deep expertise actually creates creates noise,
it's just
and how
interesting. It
story
just seems to be the
clarifies
way
it.
our brains
The
are
four
hardwired
audience
to make
types that
sense out of the
should
madness
reshape
of being human
every
beings.
high-stakes conversation.
It is some madness,
and
I'll
the
tell you that.
communication grid that turns your
Well,
story
this has been awesome.
into an actionable
We're
strategy.
exposed to our story
You'll
cycle
discover
Genie.
why
I
deep
thank you again for
expertise
having
actually
me on your
creates
show, and I
noise
sent you
and
over
how story
what it found
clarifies
about
it.
your brand
The four
storytelling
audience
and
types
so forth.
that should reshape
And
every high-stakes
what was your take on
conversation
what you received?
and the communication grid
I mean,
that turns
it's
your story
pretty astonishing
into an
what it
actionable
can do.
strategy. You'll discover why
And it's
deep
been very helpful as
expertise
well because
actually
I'm
creates
creating new
noise
websites.
and
It
how
was
story
like it found me at
clarifies it.
exactly the
The
right
four
moment,
audience types
and
that
it
should
gave me
reshape
some
every high-stakes
really interesting
conversation
insights.
and
I
the
also enjoyed
communication grid that
what
turns
the
your
conversation
story
that we
into an
had going through
actionable
ABT
strategy.
on the
You'll
show as
discover
well.
why deep expertise actually creates
being able
noise
to
and how story clarifies
look through a whole
it.
website
The four audience
and then
types that
distill
should
a whole
reshape
website with all these
every
different pages
high-stakes conversation
down to a single
and
simple
the
structure like
communication
ABT
grid that turns your
is
story
immensely
into
powerful.
an
And I think it's
actionable
something that you don't
strategy.
really
You'll discover why deep
do,
expertise
because
actually
generally
creates
when we're making a
noise
website,
and
we're
how
like
story clarifies
going on to
it.
the different
The
pages.
four
We're not
audience
thinking about how
types
they
that should
necessarily
reshape
fit together.
every
I mean, some
high-stakes
people can, but
conversation
I can't.
and the
It's
communication
really hard to
grid
keep
that
all
turns
these
your story
balls in the
into
air.
an actionable
But of course, a machine
strategy.
can do that.
You'll discover
And
why deep
that's the
expertise
value of
actually
a tool
creates
like that.
noise
It's astonishing
and
what it
how
can do.
story clarifies
Good. I'm glad
The
you think
four
so. I mean,
audience
we're very
types
proud
that
of
should
what it's doing.
reshape
The other thing
every
it does
high-stakes
is it also
conversation
takes you as the
and the
brand out of
communication
the
grid that
central
turns
figure
your story
in your
into an
communication.
actionable
So
strategy.
it writes to the
You'll
website
discover why
visitor,
deep
to
expertise
your
actually
reader.
creates noise
What's in it for
and
them?
how
What do they
story
want? But why
clarifies
don't
it.
they currently
The
have
four
it?
audience
Therefore,
types
you're
that
on
should
the right
reshape
website
every
to fix that.
high-stakes
Or you reach
conversation
Rob,
and the
who can come in
communication
and
grid
teach
that
your
turns
team
your
how to
story
solve this
into an
very problem
actionable
you're wrestling
strategy.
with right now.
You'll
But it writes
discover
all
why
of your
deep expertise
content
actually
from
creates
your
noise
audience's
and
point of
how
view. And
story
anybody
clarifies
listening
it.
to this, go to your
The
website
four
right now.
audience
Go to your
types
landing
that should
page
reshape
or
every
homepage and
high-stakes
see if
conversation
you are not just
and
writing
the
all about you and your
communication
brand.
grid that turns
You know,
your
pounding
story
your chest
into an
and
actionable
how actually
strategy.
very little
You'll
you have in
discover
there
why deep
about your
expertise
reader.
actually
And
creates
it's not,
noise
I'm not
and how
throwing anyone under
story
the bus. This is
clarifies
just
it.
a natural
The four audience types that
proclivity
should
of
reshape
what
every
people do when
high-stakes
they are writing about
conversation
their brands.
and
They
the
write about
communication
themselves
grid that
when they should
turns your
really
story
be writing about
into an
their audience.
actionable strategy.
It's really hard as well.
You'll discover why
Like,
deep expertise actually creates
there's a
noise
guy who was a
and
kind of
how
mentor figure of
story
me.
clarifies it.
Real
The
expert,
four
I would say, in
audience
sales
types that
was his
should
thing.
reshape
He's really good at
every
that.
high-stakes
And
conversation
a big part of sales
and the
is being able
communication
to
grid that turns
understand
your
your client's
story
problem or your
into
lead's
an
problem and show
actionable
that you can solve their problem. It needs to
strategy.
be about them.
You'll discover why deep
And
expertise
he was
actually
helping me
creates
with my
noise
business
and
back then,
how
which was quite
story
young.
clarifies it.
And
The
he
four
asked me
audience types that should
very
reshape every
eye-opening question,
high-stakes
which was,
conversation and the
is the
communication
problem that
grid
you
that
have
turns
named
your story into an
just the opposite of
actionable
your solution?
strategy. You'll
we kind of
discover
think,
why deep
"Oh, I've got it.
expertise
It's,
actually
they're
creates
just, like,
noise and
not
how
got my
story
thing."
clarifies it.
And we think, oh,
The
it's
four
totally about
audience
them, but
types
actually,
that should
no,
reshape
it's just
every
about us. We just
high-stakes
phrased it slightly
conversation
differently.
and the
So it takes real
communication
talent
grid that turns
to be
your
able
story
and discipline, I
into
would
an
say.
actionable
I think it's a skill
strategy.
one can
You'll
learn these
discover why
things.
deep expertise actually creates noise
It takes
and how
discipline
story
in order to
clarifies it.
really
The four
empathize
audience
and
types that
let
should
go of
reshape
your own
every
ego
high-stakes
and
conversation
thinking of yourself as
and
the
the
center of everything,
communication
and
grid
really
that turns
focus on
your
your
story
audience.
into an actionable
Well, it's a
strategy.
survival thing.
You'll
We
discover
place
why
ourselves
deep
at the center of the
expertise
story
actually
because
creates
our
noise
limbic
and
brain
how
is about
story
survival. It's about
clarifies
me.
it.
What do I got to do
The
right
four
now to
audience
survive this
types that should
situation?
reshape
And yet,
every
whenever we're
high-stakes
selling or getting someone
conversation
to buy
and the
into something that we're
communication
trying
grid that turns
to,
your
you know,
story
to
into an
influence them on,
actionable
it's about their survival.
strategy.
You got to speak
You'll
to their
discover
survival
why
thing.
deep
What's in it
expertise
for
actually
them?
creates noise
How is it
and
going
how
to
story
solve this major
clarifies it.
frustration and problem?
The four
that they've
audience
got?
types that should reshape every
Yeah, so
high-stakes
interesting.
conversation.
How can people learn
and
more
the
about you, Rob, and the
communication
great work you
grid
do?
that turns your story
Well, I'm probably
into
most
an
active
actionable
on Instagram
strategy.
at
You'll
Rob D.
discover
Willis.
why deep
I'm posting there every
expertise
single
actually
day.
creates
I
noise and
break
how
down
story
ideas about
clarifies
strategic
it.
storytelling.
The four
and
audience
a bit
types
of
that should
a hobby of
reshape
mine is I like
every
breaking down
high-stakes
speakers,
conversation,
be they
and the
politicians or
communication
business
grid
people,
that turns
or
your
even people in
story
films,
into an
and talk about
actionable
the structure of what they're
strategy.
doing, how
You'll
they're trying to get their
discover why
ideas
deep
across.
expertise
Yeah,
actually creates
awesome.
noise,
So that's the best
and
place to
how
send 'em, over to
story
Instagram.
clarifies
I would say
it.
Instagram,
The four audience
or
types that
LinkedIn.
should reshape
Anyway, I'm pretty easy to
every
find. If you look up Rob
high-stakes
D. Willis,
conversation,
because
and
there's
the
a million Rob
communication
Willises in the
grid
world.
that turns your
what's
story
D
into
stand
an
for?
actionable
Douglas.
strategy.
Okay.
You'll discover
Robert
why
Douglas
deep
Willis.
expertise
Yeah, Robert
actually
Douglas
creates
Willis, yeah.
noise,
Very nice.
and how
Sounds like you
story
should be an author
clarifies
of
it.
some
The
famous
four
book.
audience
Robert
types that
Well,
should
that is the
reshape
aim.
every high-stakes conversation.
Not a
and
famous
the
song, but a
communication
famous book.
grid that turns
Yes.
your story
Well,
into
Rob,
an
thank you so much for
actionable
being here. I appreciate
strategy.
it.
You'll
Thank you for having me
discover
on,
why
Pop. This has
deep
been great fun.
expertise actually creates noise. And I don't know about you, but I really love that conversation with Rob. I learned a lot in the process. And if you know of anyone else who would benefit from his wisdom, please share this episode with them. Hey, if you do me a huge favor and jump over to iTunes or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts and leave me a rating and review, I'd really appreciate it. And I hope you'll join me next Monday when Brett Hurt is going to be here. He's a futurist, tech entrepreneur, and author of the new book, Love Conquers Fear: Humanity, AI, and the Age of Abundance for All. So I hope you'll check that out on Monday. And until then, remember that the most potent story you will ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make that one epic. Thanks so much for listening.